Okay, morning everyone. Thank you all for joining. We'll make a start as we are just bang on time. I can see some people trickling in. So welcome. Thank you for attending this morning. So the topic of today really is to have a bit of a reflection on the recent retail attacks that we've seen. For those that are aware, in the UK, there's been a lot of detail in the media about these, and we know if cyber attacks make the mainstream media, they usually are pretty significant. So just a bit of background on myself. I'm the Microsoft practice lead within CyberOne. Lots of experience in the industry, been in PwC, been in Microsoft for a long period of time. And yes, looking forward to presenting today's topic. So I will just jump straight in. Now, for those of you who have listened to me talk before, you'll know that I always like to bring up some statistics at the beginning. I think it's a good way to frame the conversation. So what I did this time is something slightly different. I set myself a 30-minute deadline to do some research, all about what has happened in the prior month. So I did allow myself to use AI to speed this up, but what I made sure to do is just fact check anything that the AI spat out for me. So you can see the sources down in the bottom right there. So in about 30 minutes, I found the following things. So I saw 10 new instances of ransomware within the last month. I saw 20 new data breaches. Some of them we'll talk about today. I saw 21 forms of other cyber attacks. So that could be things like phishing or identity-based compromises that I've just sort of grouped together for simplicity. From what I could tell, there's 5 new forms of malware also being discovered as well in the past month. And then finally, there's 30 new CVEs or kind of known and defined vulnerabilities have also been discovered. So this is all, and I really want to emphasize this, this information is all from May of this year. So within a 1 month period, this is the kind of, and these are the items that, we're discovering, people in our industry are discovering. We can say for certain there is other forms of ransomware, of malware, there's other cyber attacks happening right now that nobody has any awareness of because they're so sophisticated and because we don't have the detection capabilities for them at the moment. So I think it's always good to frame these conversations, and I think it's very obvious that, as the good guys in this industry, we're always up against innovation coming from the bad actors. So, with that said, I want to talk a little bit about the retail attacks specifically. So, the first one, probably the biggest one that we're all probably well aware of, is the Marks and Spencer attack. So, this was disclosed sort of late April of this year, and the attack was a combination of an identity-based attack as well as the usage of something called Dragon Force, which I'll talk about them a bit later. Now, the impact of it was pretty significant. So ultimately, a large amount of Marks and Spencer systems were encrypted by this ransomware, which resulted in the online shopping of the store being paused completely for probably most of the best part of 30 days maybe. It's only just been, I think maybe 2 or 3 days ago now, their online ordering is back up. In addition to that, the actual in-store stock, so that the food and clothes and whatnot that they will have in their physical stores was also disrupted quite heavily as well. There's a number floating around that you'll see, so around £30 million loss is the projected cost of this incident. Now, it could be more than that. It could be less, in fairness, but we won't really know until it's resolved. And probably the main thing to highlight here is that this is not a resolved incident. They are working through and remediating what they can, but it isn't finished. So just be aware of that. And then critically as well, customer data was compromised. So including my own, I'll say, I got an email from them a few weeks ago saying, your data's being involved in this cyber attack. So yeah, I'm sure plenty of you on the call have also received that email. Going beyond that one, a very similar attack, in fact, by the same threat actors in this case. Co-op, again, a retailer in the UK. Again, this kind of came out late April, early May time. This one, yeah, very similar impact, perhaps not quite as bad as what happened to Marks and Spencer, but it did cause a co-op to have to shut down a lot of their logistical systems. So this is an example of where the victim, the target organization, was able to take some remedial action during the initial attack. So Co-op managed to close off some of their own systems to prevent them being, captured by that ransomware. So an overall pretty good move. Unfortunately, again, 20 million customer records compromised. Again, some of us probably directly affected by that on a personal level. And then finally, sort of the big three retail attacks that have happened recently was Harrods. Now, Harrods, in fairness, did a pretty good job. So they detected the threat. They recognized that there was a number of unauthorized access attempts into their key systems. And as a result of that, they then quarantined some of their networks. So they completely isolated the parts of their networks that they thought were breached. And so far, so good. It seems that they didn't actually have a full breach occurring. They had an incident which they responded to and were able to keep themselves protected. So as of today, really, there's been no confirmed actual breach of data. It's not to say that, tomorrow there won't be some new discovery, but so far Harrods have come out of it relatively unscathed. Now, all three of these companies were targeted by the same group. And it's actually, you read different news articles and it can be a bit unclear what exactly has happened here. So, in terms of the attribution, you can see down there at the bottom that there is an organization who call themselves Dragon Force. Now, they are a ransomware as a service group. So, what they do is they create malicious software, right? They create malware, they create ransomware. They then sell their services to other threat actors. Now, the UK National Crime Agency has linked these incidents to an organization called Scattered Spider. You can see in the brackets there, they have a couple of other sort of names for them too. And really, it's a combination of both Dragon Force and Scattered Spider that have orchestrated this attack. So the takeaway really is that Scattered Spider, I suppose, are the masterminds. They are the ones who've executed the initial identity-based compromises. They've performed the initial social engineering to access these networks, and then they've used the Dragon Force ransomware to actually weaponize and execute their mission. So there's a combination of two threat actors involved. It seems to be the case. Now, I mentioned intrusion and social engineering. A pattern with each of these particular events is that Scattered Spider have looked to compromise third-party organizations, which have then led to a compromise of places like Marks and Spencer. So what they've targeted is offshore IT companies. So TCS in particular have been named in the media. So Marks and Spencer were outsourcing some of their IT to TCS. What ultimately happened is employees of TCS were compromised, which then allowed Scattered Spider to laterally traverse across the boundary of TCS into Marks and Spencer and then perform their attack. So this highlights the importance of securing your supply chain, and that's something I'll talk about shortly. I thought it'd be interesting just to expand on Scattered Spider a little bit. So they are relatively recently discovered, kind of believe they began operating in 2022. And they do, as I mentioned earlier, they like to partner with ransomware as a service groups. So some of you may have also heard of Black Cat. I mentioned Dragon Force earlier. These are two groups that are distinct entities from Scattered Spider, but that they like to partner with and kind of perform attacks together. Now, in terms of targets, it's pretty broad. So we know about M&S, we know about Co-op and Harrods, but they've also targeted a couple of resorts and casinos in Las Vegas, so MGM Resorts and also the Caesars Entertainment brand as well. Obviously, both of those have a really large presence in Las Vegas and elsewhere. Interestingly, they've also targeted Okta, who are an identity vendor as well, so that one's a slightly different target type. It seems that they're targeting the Western world primarily, so UK, US, and different portions of Europe as well. In terms of some of their tactics, techniques, and procedures, so TTPs, I won't read through all of them, but social engineering is certainly a large part of it. They do interesting things like SIM swapping, which allows them to bypass certain MFA controls. I'll touch on that later as well. And they also use places like Microsoft Teams or Slack to basically impersonate users and to appear as a normal employee. And again, something I can elaborate on later. Now, they're dangerous primarily because they use social engineering. We probably all are aware that the weakest link in any cyber defense is ultimately the human. People make mistakes at the end of the day, and that allows these bad actors to bypass a lot of defenses by engineering and abusing people's trust, for example. And then finally, I won't go through these defensive recommendations because I'll go into more depth in these a bit later. But just as a quick glance, you can see some of the suggestions on how to deal with an attacker of this type. So I thought it'd be also interesting just to talk through a number of other notable breaches. The first three that I'll bring up are also retailers. So North Face, clothing brand, as probably many of us know, part of their US organization was compromised, and that again resulted in customer data being stolen. Cartier, so again, probably very well known. So based in France, but their whole operation globally was compromised, again resulting in customer data being lost. And then finally, Victoria's Secret. This one was a bit different. It seemed to be an attack on their public-facing websites. So it affected their sales, which then affected their share price. As far as I'm aware, there wasn't any customer data stolen. Now, Victoria's Secret haven't disclosed exactly what happened, so the information there is not that detailed at the moment. But you'll notice, again, two of these things happened in April at the same time as the retail attacks in the UK. Now, they aren't linked. There's no link between the things on screen and the previous ones I've talked about. But I just think it's interesting that there is a pattern there that retailers are targeted. The obvious reason is they have lots of customer data. You know, they have billing data, they have your address, your email, your name, all these different bits of information. Now, in addition to those, looking just at May, I've just brought up a couple of bullet points down at the bottom of other data breaches that have happened. So Coinbase, Adidas, Ascension, Coca-Cola, and AT&T, all big companies. We probably all recognize, at least four of those, maybe all five. Again, those all happened in May. So in 1 month, we've had a number of incidents, and these are all quite significant, by the way, in their own right. They deserve their own slide, but we just don't have time today to go through all of that. Okay, so we've discovered, we've talked about how retail is targeted, but realistically, whether your organization works in this sector or you don't, there is still plenty of lessons to be learned. No industry is immune to threat actors. So I'm just going to talk through some general trends quickly. So identity theft is huge. What you should consider is how you secure your employees, but perhaps more importantly, in some aspects, how do you secure contractors or vendors? How about your actual end customer? How do you secure the identities for all these different user types to prevent identity theft? So something to think about for now. In addition to that, software, whether that's software deployed directly on your devices or whether it's software as a service. Really, this has been the case for a long time now, but attackers live off the land. And what we mean by that is that it's rare for them to install additional tools on your network now. Now, they may deploy ransomware, but that's not really a tool. It's not, a normal piece of software. They will live off the land. And what that means is that they will abuse legitimate tools to carry out illegitimate actions. For example, they may use Microsoft Teams as a way to communicate with your employees in a way that seems to be normal and natural, and that allows them to then socially engineer employees. I mentioned this earlier, but third party and supply chain risks. So this has been the case for years now. The supply chain is a large problem, right? We all partner with vendors, with other companies. If we're not vetting what they do for their security, they could be our weakest link. So any organizations that you are partnering with in some capacity, you need to think about how they are keeping themselves secure, because if that third party gets compromised, that could result in your organization being compromised as well. Internal comms abuse, so Microsoft Teams, Slack, Google Chat, whatever it is, it's not the actual software here that's a problem. But if I was to compromise a user within your environment and I was able to log in as that user, I would be able to use these communication tools to speak with anyone in your business, right? I could reach out to anyone I wanted to. I could target certain people in your organization, and that would allow me to, like I said earlier, socially engineer those individuals. So something to be mindful of. There are some mechanisms you can use to secure these communication channels. So something worth considering, something I will raise later too. Finally, and this is it's quite closely linked to the previous one, but help desk manipulation. So many of us will have internal or external support teams. Well, guess what? The attackers will target those individuals as well because they know that those people will likely have some kind of admin permissions. So if I can socially engineer those individuals, for example, I might raise a phony support ticket. I might say, oh yeah, my device is, my email's not working, or I can't log in, or whatever it may be. That then will result in a help desk support engineer contacting the attacker. They may then remotely connect to the compromised device, which could expose the help desk admin credentials and then allow the attacker to escalate their attack from there. So something that we need to be mindful of is our support teams need to be trained to, in particular, watch out for this kind of behavior, being manipulated, being socially engineered. Okay, so that's all quite high level. We're going to progressively dig deeper as we go through this. So just in terms of some general lessons learned, what I would say is don't wait for a breach to happen to secure yourself. We see that time and time again. You really need to prepare for a breach. The language back in the day was assume compromise or assume breach. The logic was if you assume the worst, then you'll prepare yourself for the worst. And that mindset is still very important. So the first thing that I'm talking about there is that these retail attacks, they were detectable and ultimately they were preventable. Now, there's reasons that that wasn't the case for some of the companies I talked about earlier, and I'll recap those shortly. But yeah, important to understand that these things were preventable ultimately. And the weakest link wasn't necessarily the tooling. Often it's the visibility that organizations have. So again, something I will reflect on shortly. And then security, nowadays is about resiliency. It's about security over the long term. You can't just prevent an attack in the short term and then think you're doing a great job and give yourself a pat on the back. You have to have that long-term resiliency. So if we kind of marry these up with the logical conclusions, so for number one, we need to be thinking about end user training. We need to be looking at user behavioral analysis to understand what is a normal type of behavior for our users. We need to think about anti-phishing and also zero trust principles as well. Number two, the direct link there is we have to have some kind of 24 by 7 detection ability. If you do not have visibility, round the clock. You could buy all the very best security tools in the world, all the most expensive, the things with the most cool features. You could deploy all of them, but ultimately, if you don't have a way to detect all of the behavior, all of the actions that are taking place across your environment, you'll still have gaps. So it's really critical you have eyes on every hour of every day. And then finally, preparedness is really important. I'm going to talk about incident response shortly, so I'll just move on to the meat and potatoes of today. So this is what you're all here for, really. These are the actions that I wanted to talk through. So I've grouped 5 total sections, and each of them have 5 kind of sub-actions within them. So I'll start with something that I think is quite intuitive. So lock down your identity and access is kind of my first recommendation. So what we want to think about here is zero trust. So the idea of never trust and always verify. We need to have this in mind for all of our users, whether they're internal or external. And this also is the case for network traffic. It's the case for devices, whether they're laptops or mobile phones. Every entity, every asset in our business, we should apply zero trust principles to. And what that means is we fundamentally do not trust these assets and entities and users. And because of that mistrust we have, it means we must always verify the activity of these entities, of these users. So really important. Now, zero trust in itself is a huge topic, so I'm just going to keep it high level for now. But those are some of the things that we will have to keep in mind. Now, strong MFA, it's obvious, but emphasis on the word strong there. What we need to be thinking about is enforcing what's called phishing resistant MFA. So this is where we start to consider FIDO2 passkeys, which are a physical item that you will hold in your hand. And also we start to consider authenticator apps. Now, I imagine many of you are using authenticator apps. This could be Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator, for example. These are a really great step. But FIDO2 passkeys kind of is the ultimate step at the moment. Now, there are organizations like Microsoft developing other options that are beyond these two examples, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend those at the moment because they are very much a work in progress. But it's good for us to just be aware that even beyond FIDO2 passkeys, there are more modern options and slowly coming up too. And then logically, we need to block legacy authentication protocols. This is a really obvious one, but we see it all the time where we have old protocols still enabled. Maybe your organization has some old software that requires them to be enabled, but really we would want to move away from some of these things. So yeah, please keep that in mind. Role-based access, again, the principle here is quite simple. What we want to do is adhere to something called the principle of least privilege. The idea is that we provide our users and admins the bare minimum permissions they need to do their job and nothing more. Because if we overprivilege our users and admins, then it means if a compromise was to happen, the damage is greater. So really important to understand that we need to give people the bare minimum that we can get away with ultimately. And then we need to review those permissions. So people's jobs change, their attitude towards work changes, various other things will change as well. So we need to review permissions continually. With modern identity tools like Microsoft Entra, you can set up automated permission reviews that can run once a week if you want them to. So, there isn't necessarily any manual work there. It's just about creating those automations to validate whether permissions can be removed or whether they should be kept. Okay, so we also need to consider detection, so specifically around identity-based risks in this case. So I mentioned user behavior very briefly earlier. It's something that I'll touch on a couple of times today. But things like impossible travel, the usage of anonymous IPs, privilege escalation, password spray attacks, and leaked credentials, to name a few. These are things that we should be monitoring for. These are all identity-based threats, and we should be have some kind of tool or some kind of mechanism to monitor for things out of the ordinary. So when our users behave in a way that for them at a personal level is unusual, we need to have a mechanism to detect and alert on that behavior as well. And then lifecycle management. So we need to think about how we onboard and offboard our users. This is, regarding your joiners, movers, leavers process. So it is a combination of the actual documented procedures, but also the technical controls that enforce these things. So when someone leaves the business, you need to be completely disabling their account immediately, with no exception. If you have a disgruntled employee who leaves the business, they might cause some damage if they want to. So let's just disable that account. The other thing to consider is if you were to leave stale accounts, redundant accounts just lying around, these are a great asset for an attacker to get hold of because they look like a legitimate user. They're just hanging around there, but obviously the attackers gain control of that identity. So we want to be doing a cleanup of our identities as well on some kind of routine basis. So these are all identity focused recommendations, starting with some simpler things. I'm sure we're all aware of many of the things I've mentioned here. So to move on from that, Action two then is to protect your data. Now, what I've said at the top is data is the new gold. Probably the word new is a bit of a stretch there. Data has been, the equivalent of gold for a long time now, and it only continues to become more and more valuable. Ultimately, a really large portion of cyber attacks are all about the data and compromising of that data. So one of the first things that we need to do is to discover what data we actually have. This is, generally speaking, a pretty large and complicated task, but we need to understand what data our organization has, both in the on-prem network and in our cloud environments as well. So we need some kind of tooling, some kind of behaviors to understand exactly what information we hold. Do we hold sensitive data? Almost certainly we do. Do we have credit card information potentially? Do we have things like passports, like identification cards, those kind of details? Do we have any proprietary IP unique to our business that we need to keep protected? Potentially as well. These are all data types that we really need to consider. So part one is discovery of that information. What do we actually have? And the second part is then classifying that data. So which of, let's say we've just to put a number on it, we've got 1 million different documents in our environment. Each one of those documents contains different amounts of data. How do we then classify those of 1 million documents? Do we apply confidential labels, highly confidential labels? What about top secret? Some of that data will actually be not sensitive. So we need to maybe think about applying a classification. Something like general is quite commonly used, just a general document, for example. So again, I'm trying to distill a really large topic into a couple of bullet points, but discovery of data, then classification of that data as well. Encryption, so great. We've discovered the data, we've classified the data, but now we also need to encrypt the data. We need to be thinking about encrypting the data at rest and also in transit. So at rest meaning, if we talk about the document example, when that document is stored in a folder somewhere, is it encrypted when it's just sat there doing nothing? It has to be. And because if that document contains anything important, we need to protect it at all times. Then let's say that document is emailed or sent over Teams or some other communication channel. Is the actual network communication happening there? Is that protected in some way? So we need to be encrypting on that level too. Now, I've mentioned the second bullet point in number 2 there is around mission critical data. This won't apply for most of you, so I don't want to scare you into something, a very large task here. But if we've got critical data, if we're part of critical national infrastructure, if we're a bank, if we're part of the government, maybe a council, we may have some genuinely critical data. We need to consider even more advanced options, and this is where we might want to think about something called bring your own key and something else called hold your own key. Now, we just don't have time to go into those topics today. An upcoming webinar that I will be going into is all around data security, and I will talk about those topics in much greater detail. I just want to get them on people's radar. So bring your own key and hold your own key. These are advanced methods of protecting data. So just keep those in mind and maybe have a quick Google search if you're interested. Number 3, pretty obvious one, data loss prevention. So DLP takes a number of formats. We need to be thinking about sharing over email. We need to be thinking about both downloading and uploading data. We need to think about removable media like USB devices. We need to be thinking about cloud repositories like OneDrive, Dropbox, Google Drive, all these places. There's lots of aspects to DLP. Again, it's quite a deep topic, but we need to be blocking certain behaviors. So an obvious one is USB devices. Does anyone in our business really need to be using a USB? Certainly within our business, within CyberOne, it's very rare. Now, there are occasional exceptions to that. But what it means is that we can generally have a policy that blocks removable media like a USB. And then if there is a specific need for using a USB, that individual can raise a support ticket. It can go through the right paths to then get that exception raised for a time-bound window. And we'll allow that exception for a small period of time. Now, if we think about email DLP, if we go back actually to how we were classifying our data, let's say we've got a confidential document. What we want to do is make sure that that document is protected once it's sent over email. So we need to be thinking around whether we even allow that behavior to happen. Should we prevent sensitive data being emailed? Potentially, it's something to consider. So number 4, so context-aware access controls. It sounds scary, but the idea really is that we need a dynamic way to assess the context in which data is being used. So let's say that I'm in the corporate office, I'm on the corporate network, and I'm accessing our internal SharePoint, and I'm downloading a file. That is a fairly safe operation because I'm on the corporate network, I'm using my corporate device, I'm using corporate SharePoint, and we should have controls around all of these things. But generally, that's a fairly safe action. Now, let's say I travel abroad, I might go to a risky country, I may be on a public network. If I go to SharePoint and try and download the same document, I would suggest there should be additional controls in place to prevent that behavior. Because that person in a risky country on a risky network, yeah, probably downloading internal data is not a good idea. So this is where that context is important, and there are tools out there such as Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps that allow you to have dynamic controls around data depending on the context in which that data is accessed. So it's more simple than it sounds, but this is something that a lot of organizations just have no current, configuration or implementation of. Auditing, so data usage and the movement of data, we can audit all of these things, right? We can have alerting mechanisms set up. Now, ideally, we would have some kind of SOC that uses a SIEM or SOAR platform to allow for triaging of this kind of audit data. That would be the ideal scenario. But the general idea here is that we need to be monitoring how our users are interacting with data in our organization. So that will allow us to detect potentially malicious activity. A common example would be someone's leaving the business. They want to download loads of documents they've been working on across their 5-year tender in tenure in the business. Do we want them to download 5 years worth of data in a couple of days just before they're leaving the business? Probably not. So if we're able to audit that behavior, detect on that mass downloading information, we can then prevent that person exfiltrating data. It may not be a cyber attack as such, they may not be a malicious actor. They may be doing it because they feel like they created loads of valuable documents and they want to take them with them. But as a business, we can't allow that. So we need to be auditing user behavior. Right, so moving on to number three, I would argue this is perhaps the most important of all of the actions that I'll talk us through. I've mentioned it a couple of times. It's about real-time detection. So ultimately having some kind of SOC capability that has a 24 by 7 function is critical. And one of the benefits of having a SOC that uses a SIEM platform such as Microsoft Sentinel is that it will aggregate logs into one centralized place. So logs from all of your existing security tools, as well as other information, your data information that we've just discussed, pulls all of that into one place and creates this unified, centralized view of all of the log data in your environment. From there, we can then layer on that 24 by 7 by 365 security operations. So this, it's essentially mandatory now that we have an ability to detect, investigate, and then contain threats. Attackers do not attack when it's convenient for you. They attack at the least, the worst possible times. They will attack you out of hours, they'll attack you on the weekend, or they'll attack you on public holidays. This is all obvious stuff, but it's something that it does get overlooked. And because of those reasons, we have to have an ability to detect that behavior at any given time. So this is where, a true 24 by 7 security operations team is critical to spotting something bad happening. In terms of triage and investigation, so this is where again, that SOC team that I've mentioned, they will be looking at understanding who, which users or entities are involved in this particular incident that we're seeing, when. So, when did it begin? Maybe it began a couple of days ago, and we're still trying to get a handle over, the breach that's going on. Where? So, whereabouts in our organization did the attack originate, and obviously how critical as well. We can map these kind of things against TTPs, so tactics, techniques, and procedures. And we can also use things like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which is an industry standard framework as well for categorizing incidents and attacks. So very important that we have a way to understand the severity of a given alert, because if we don't have a way to triage information, everything looks like it's incredibly critical, but that won't be the case. Some behaviors that we might see from our users or some malicious action that we might see is worse than other things. So we need to have a way of prioritizing all of these signals that we're detecting within our SIEM platform. In terms of threat intelligence, so any good SIEM tool nowadays will have a built-in threat intelligence capability, but what our opinion is to actually enhance that with other tools as well. So you might invest in a paid-for threat intelligence source, but you can also consider using open source threat intelligence. You may even look at trying to get some kind of dark web monitoring service in place as well. Now that won't be cheap, but it provides a real probably one of the most sophisticated cyber sort of tools we have available to us is things like dark web monitoring, because they go beyond what a SOC can do. Typically allows you to perform a takedown of spoof domains, for example. So very important that we consider threat intelligence. Internally within CyberOne, we've developed our own threat intelligence platform that allows us to capture data from locations that we believe are most important. We combine that with a dark web monitoring service that we have with Microsoft Sentinel, and we also use a paid-for source called Polarity. So we've got all these different options available to us, ultimately four major sources of threat intelligence that all feed into our SOC that then allow us to have a real good understanding of globally what are the trends and also sector specific what are the trends. So within healthcare or retail, finance, whatever it may be, we can understand what are the trends within that sector. Are we seeing a rise in phishing, a rise in ransomware, maybe identity-based compromises, and that will allow us to keep our customers informed, based on and make them aware of the likely threats that they're going to receive from the bad guys. So threat intelligence is a little bit underrated in my opinion. There's a lot of value to be had there. So finally, in this section, all of this data, so 1 to 4 really is about capturing data and trying to understand the raw log information that we're centralizing in our SIEM tool. Number 5 is about then automating responses to it. So yes, we need humans in our SOC who will provide the contextual understanding of an incident, but we need to automate that behavior to a degree. So where we can, we'll create SOAR automations. So security orchestration, automation, and response is SOAR. That will allow us to do things such as containment actions. So if we see a bit of unusual user behavior, we might then look to disable that user account. If we see some strange behavior on a device, we might look to quarantine that device. If we see a network is compromised, such as Harrods, that they ultimately isolated a couple of their networks to keep themselves safe, we can even automate that kind of output as well. Okay, so moving on, all about the human side of things. So attackers target people, not firewalls. What I mean by this is that, yeah, a firewall is in the way of the attacker. It's a barrier they need to bypass, but they aren't directly attacking your firewalls. They're aiming for the people within your organization, because the people are the weak link. So what we need to be thinking about is having modern security awareness training. We all know about phishing training. We need to keep doing that, but there's other things that we should be doing. So MFA fatigue attacks, which is where an attacker will repeatedly cause an MFA prompt. So if you imagine there's a user, they're on an important meeting, their phone keeps vibrating, it's showing them you need to MFA, you need to approve MFA, 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 MFA. Eventually that user might just approve the request. So that's an MFA fatigue attack. So we need to be training our users about this. We need to consider vishing, which is basically phishing but over voice, so typically a phone call. We need to consider quishing, which is using a QR code. So people will scan a QR code and that will take them to a malicious website. And an even more modern version of all of these things is deepfake. So you may have seen in the news, it comes up occasionally where, some CEO has been impersonated by a deepfake video or voice, and then some employee has fallen for that and they've sent $1 million to, a phony invoice. So that does happen. So we need to be making people aware of that. Very important. Okay, run tabletop and cyber attack simulation exercises. So these should be done at least annually. And the idea is engaging all employees in the business with a fun activity. So wargaming or tabletop exercises are quite fun. If you've never done one, I would recommend certainly looking into this. The idea is that you will have a number of employees around the table, typically all in person, and you will run through a mock cyber attack, and you'll have people play out certain roles. You'll have them take on certain tasks, and as a group, they will try to detect and prevent, and then remediate, the cyber attack. So it can be really good fun, but people learn, they learn important information. So good activity to consider. A really simple one around MFA. Yeah, basically educate your users not to just approve MFA notifications blindly. If they haven't logged into something And if that something hasn't specifically told them to MFA, then yeah, they shouldn't be just approving it. It's still a bad habit that some people have. So make them mindful to really think about approving an MFA challenge before it appears. In terms of verification procedures, so this is around the financial side really. So when an invoice is being paid or money is being transferred somewhere, have a four eyes principle at least. So four eyes means two people, so two sets of eyes basically. So you want at least two people to verify that the CEO has requested you send money somewhere. Let's just double check. It's probably not malicious, but let's double check. And to challenge someone like the CEO or the board or other executives, you need to empower staff to say no without repercussion. So if a member of staff feels like there's something off about this, it feels fishy to me. Yeah, my boss is telling me to send money somewhere, but something's just wrong. Your staff need to be empowered to say no to that, without then being, told off or have some disciplinary. So really important that the culture there aligns to the outcome that we want, which is a more secure business. So protect your VIPs and high value targets. They will typically be spearphished. They will be targeted by attackers. So we want to keep in mind that, C-levels and other important people in the business, yeah, we need to keep an extra eye on them a lot of the time. Okay, and then the final section, so incident response. It's really important that our incident response plans don't just collect dust. What I mean by that is once you've developed an incident response plan, you need to actually practice using it. Because if no one's actually used the plan, in a real scenario, it might fail. The plan may not work. Also, if the plan is not kept up to date, and 2 years later, you're in a security incident, the plan is basically irrelevant now. So you need to be, yes, documenting your incident response processes, but you need to actually be testing them for real. So running breach events, running simulations, testing them out, making sure all the right stakeholders are involved as well. So speaking of stakeholders, we need to be considering our cross-functional teams. So what you need to understand here is it is not just the responsibility of your security team to keep the business safe. Every employee has a role. Every team leader, every manager, every senior person in the business has a part to play. What we need to make sure is that they are involved in the incident response planning so they understand what the expectation of them is, and make sure that they're aware of the plan. Make sure that they're aware of the different actions that will be given out. So it seems obvious, but yeah, if a cyber attack was to happen tomorrow, and the only people who are aware of your plan are your two cybersecurity engineers, you're probably going to have a bad time because the rest of the business doesn't know how to behave in that scenario. Next, penetration testing. So, penetration testing, I'm sure we're all aware we should be doing this at least annually. You need to have that point in time check to see, are we vulnerable to anything major at this present moment, at least annually. If you're a business that works in some kind of critical space or deals with large amounts of money or large amounts of data, you should be looking at more frequently than an annual pen test, but they should be a regular occurrence at minimum. Now, it's important that from those pen tests, we actually learn the lessons. So, if the penetration tester is able to successfully breach your organization, how did they do it? And what are the things we need to put in place to prevent that? So, whether it's changing our security configuration, whether it's improving our incident response plan, we need to benefit from the pen test. We need to learn our lessons from it. So, it seems obvious again, but something we see all the time where people do an annual pen test and it's just seen as a box ticking exercise and no real action comes out the back of it. It's a waste of time. You're wasting the value that you've got there. Cybersecurity is an investment ultimately. So when we're making those investments, we need to be actually learning the lessons they're teaching us. Okay, number four, pre-configure your response actions. So it kind of touched on this earlier, but where you can automate certain behavior. So if we need to disable a user account, revoke a session, block some kind of network, we need to be pre-configuring these automations so that at a click of a button, we can, execute some kind of automated containment. Something just to double down on because it is really important. Ultimately, if a task is going to take a human 10 minutes, if we can automate that function, it's going to take a couple of seconds instead. So the time saving is going to be huge. And when it comes to cyber incidents, the difference between 10 minutes and 10 seconds is ginormous. That could be the difference between preventing the threat from expanding or being fully compromised. In terms of pre-creation as well, we actually also need to think about media, about our legal responses, right? We have to publicly disclose breaches. So how are we going to disseminate that information? We need to use the proper channels. If we're a regulated industry, you need to be legally, going to the right governing body, explaining the detail of what's happened, and giving them that information up front. Often, if you do that, they will be more lenient. It's very common now that if you're forthcoming with the fact that you've been breached, you provide all the relevant information to the right governing body, they're less likely to issue a fine, or they may reduce the cost of that fine. So something to be mindful of. Also, if you're a brand, you're a brand that people would recognize. You need to be thinking about what you will tell your customers. You need to be planning what kind of things you will put out on social media. Because if you haven't pre-planned these things and the worst was to happen, well, you can imagine that it's going to be a pretty complicated and stressful period. So, planning and preparedness is really important. Now, just linking back to the supply chain piece that I touched on earlier, number five then is around testing third-party incident response dependencies. So, if you have lots of supply chain organizations that you work with, lots of vendors, in an incident, if you're compromised, what do you need those vendors to do? Do you need anything from them? Do you need to keep them informed? How are you going to manage the relationship with them? Perhaps it was even an exploit in their product that led to you being compromised. How are you going to feed that information back to them? How are you going to work with them to resolve that? So don't just think about your business in isolation. Think about your wider ecosystem. Think of your supply chain and the dependencies that will have on your incident response plans and practices. Okay. So with that said, I've rattled through an awful lot of detail there. Appreciate that was a lot to take in. If there is further questions, then just reach out to one of the CyberOne team and we will, get back to you as soon as we can. In the meantime, just brought this up on screen. So we have a number of upcoming webinars, as I mentioned. So yeah, just pencil these into your diaries. The registration links are up on our website, on our events page. Yeah, so please consider coming along to some of these things, particularly the data one, going to be very important, right? We're going to be talking around some real great detail around how you keep your data secure. But with that, I'm going to wrap up the session. Thank you all for listening. I appreciate your time and have a good rest of your day.